The foundation stones, with their sawdust insulation chambers still intact, remain visible today near Du Bois, Wyoming, a physical testament to the enduring value of building for the worst conditions rather than merely adequate ones. Because winter always tests every structure to its absolute limits. Wind River Valley, 1841. While his American counterparts were hurrying to put up their log cabins using 8-inch pine logs and basic mud chinking, Olaf Hogan, a Norwegian immigrant, was still hard at work building his in late September. They considered his methods wasteful. Some even called him a fool. He was cutting lodgepole pines that were 14 to 16 inches in diameter, which meant he needed twice as much timber and had to put in 3 times the effort compared to what was standard for cabin construction. He meticulously packed every gap with 3 layers of sealant, first ceiling, then moss, then rope fiber, and finally clay mortar that was reinforced with horsehair. He constructed foundations that went 3 feet underground, complete with sawdust insulation between double stone walls. His neighbors finished their cabins in about 4 weeks. Hogan, on the other hand, took 11 weeks. Then January of 1842 rolled around. Temperatures plummeted to a staggering 43 degrees below zero, and winds howled at 30 miles per hour. It was a deadly cold that would push every shelter to its absolute limit. The standard cabins just couldn't hold up. Families burned through 3 cords of firewood, but still woke up to find ice forming on the inside walls. But Hogan's cabin? It maintained a cozy 68 degrees, and he used only half the wood his neighbors were burning. 7 families had to abandon their freezing cabins and squeeze into his thermal island just to survive. What did this Norwegian know about heat storage and the physics of building that the typical American frontier wisdom completely overlooked? If you enjoy stories about practical wisdom that have truly stood the test of time, then be sure to subscribe. We've got plenty more documented accounts that are worth remembering. The Wind River Valley stretched out endlessly under the bright August sun in 1841. Its golden grasslands were only interrupted by the dark line of lodgepole pines that climbed up towards the distant peaks along Beaver Creek. The sound of axes rang through the crisp morning air as new settlers raced against the clock to finish their cabins before winter arrived. Most followed the well-established pattern. They'd select the readily available pines that were 8 to 10 inches in diameter, quickly notch them, stack them high, and then stuff the gaps with whatever moss and mud they could gather in a day's work. Speed was crucial for survival on the frontier, and the generally accepted belief was that any cabin with 4 walls and a roof would be enough to get a family through a Wyoming winter. But Olaf Hogan moved through the timber with a different perspective. The 37-year-old Norwegian immigrant carefully examined each lodgepole pine with the meticulous precision of a man who had learned to build in a place where inadequate construction could mean death. Where his neighbors saw perfectly acceptable 8-inch logs, Hogan saw insufficient thermal mass. While they found 10-inch timber to be adequate, he was searching for trees that were 14 to 16 inches in diameter, the size that would provide the heat storage capacity that was essential for surviving Arctic conditions. His calloused hands, trained in the Valdres region where winters could reach 50 degrees below zero, could almost calculate thermal mass just by touch, feeling for the dense, slow-grown wood that would absorb heat during the day and then steadily release it throughout the coldest nights. Jake Morrison watched the Norwegians' timber selection with increasing disbelief. The Kentucky-born mountain man had already survived 6 Wyoming winters using standard frontier construction methods, and Hogan's approach went against everything Morrison thought he knew about practical building. "That fool's cutting trees twice the size he needs," Morrison told anyone who would listen at the trading post. "It's a waste of good timber and twice the work for absolutely no reason." Morrison's own cabin, which he had completed in just 3 weeks using conventional methods, had served him well enough during previous winters. When the temperatures dropped, he simply threw more wood on the fire and accepted that frontier life meant waking up to frozen water buckets and frost on the inside walls. But Hogan's knowledge went far deeper than mere frontier practicality. In Norway, he had learned from master builders whose techniques had been passed down for 5 generations, men who understood that thermal mass wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. Each 16-inch log contained more than twice the wood volume of Morrison's 10-inch timbers, creating what Norwegian builders called thermal batteries, massive wooden heat sinks that could store warmth during periods of active fire and then release it slowly over 6 to 8 hours. The math was precise. A 16-inch diameter log provided 201 square inches of wood cross-section, compared to just 79 square inches for Morrison's standard logs. That difference meant the ability to keep the interior warm through the longest winter nights without having to constantly tend the fire. The mockery only intensified as Hogan's construction methods became more and more apparent to the growing settlement. His neighbor stuffed moss between logs and daubed gaps with mud, a process that took maybe 3 days at the most. He, on the other hand, implemented a 3-layer chinking system that required 3 weeks of meticulous work. First, the moss was packed tightly into every gap. Then came oakum, the rope fiber used for ship caulking, pressed deep into the spaces between the logs. Finally, a carefully mixed clay mortar reinforced with horsehair, applied in thin layers that would flex with the wood movement rather than crack and fall out during temperature swings. That Norwegian is still fussing with that cabin like he's building a church, Morrison declared as September rolled around and Hogan continued his methodical construction. Winter's gonna catch him still chinking logs while the rest of us are warm inside. The settlement's consensus was clear. Hogan just didn't understand American practicality. Frontier building meant adequate construction that was completed quickly, not the elaborate perfectionism of European craftsmen who had way too much time and way too many materials. Even Hogan's foundation work drew skepticism. While others set their first course of logs directly on stone foundations, choosing the quickest path from the ground to the walls, Hogan excavated 3 feet underground and built a double-wall foundation system. Inner and outer stone walls created a chamber that he then filled with sawdust, creating an insulation barrier that would prevent the winter ground from conducting heat directly out of his cabin's floor logs. The additional labor required 2 weeks compared to the single day most settlers spent on their foundation work. Waste of good stone, the neighbors agreed as they watched Hogan's massive foundation taking shape. Ground's ground. There's no sense in digging all the way to China when you just need something level to set your logs on. But Hogan understood thermal bridge theory from his Norwegian construction practices. Heat moved through solid materials at predictable rates, and a standard stone foundation created a direct pathway for warmth to flow from the interior floor logs into the frozen earth below. His insulated foundation would prevent that heat loss, keeping the interior temperatures up while his neighbors' cabins bled warmth into the ground. By late September, as the first snows dusted the higher peaks and morning frost appeared in the valley, Hogan finally completed his cabin construction. His massive stone fireplace drew final criticism from the settlement. It was built with a 3-foot-deep hearth and heat-absorbing alloys that extended into the cabin's interior. The fireplace used far more stone than the simple backwall designs his neighbors preferred. "Fire's a fire," Morrison declared. "Flame burns the same whether it's in a big fireplace or a small one. That Norwegian's just showing off with all that stonework." But Hogan knew what his critics didn't. Thermal mass applied to fireplaces just as well as walls. His deep hearth would store approximately 50,000 British thermal units during the evening firing, releasing 6,000 to 8,000 BTUs per hour for 6 to 8 hours after the fire had died down to embers. Morrison's thin-walled fireplace heated up quickly and cooled down quickly, requiring constant fire maintenance to provide consistent warmth. As October's first blizzard approached and temperatures began their descent towards the brutal cold of a Wind River winter, the difference between adequate construction and survival-grade building would soon become apparent to every settler in the valley. October brought the first test of frontier construction as temperatures dropped into the 20s and stayed there for days at a time. Jake Morrison's cabin, like most in the settlement, began showing the limitations of standard building methods. Morning frost appeared on the interior walls where warm, moist air from breathing and cooking condensed against the cold log surfaces. Water buckets froze solid overnight, despite being placed near the fireplace. Most troubling of all, the gaps between the logs seemed to widen daily as the timber shrank in the cold, breaking apart Morrison's mud chinking and creating air leaks that sucked warm interior air out while pulling frigid exterior air in. Morrison found himself rising twice each night to rebuild his fire, feeding split pine into flames that roared hot but failed to warm the cabin's far corners. His firewood consumption climbed from half a cord in September to a full cord in October. Yet, interior temperatures swung wildly from 75 degrees near the fireplace to a chilling 45 degrees along the outer walls. The mathematics of heat loss were working against every standard cabin in the settlement. 40% of the generated warmth escaped through wall conduction, 35% through air infiltration where the chinking had failed, 15% through uninsulated foundations, and 10% through the doors and the single window each cabin possessed. 3 miles upstream, Olaf Hogan's cabin performed with the steady reliability of Norwegian engineering. His interior temperature held consistently between 65 and 70 degrees with fires built only in the evening and morning. The massive 14-inch logs stored heat during the active burning periods and then released it slowly through the coldest hours. His horsehair-reinforced clay mortar maintained its seal as the logs shrank, the flexible material contracting and expanding with the wood rather than cracking and falling out. Most remarkably, Hogan burned only 7/10 of a cord through October, while his neighbors consumed nearly twice that amount for inferior results. But instead of recognizing superior construction methods, the settlement doubled down on conventional frontier wisdom. That Norwegian just got lucky with his wood became Morrison's explanation when pressed about the disparity in fuel consumption. Just wait until the real cold hits, others added, convinced that Hogan's performance was somehow artificial or temporary. The possibility that European building knowledge might surpass American frontier practicality challenged too many assumptions about the New World's superiority over Old World methods. At Fort Bridger, Sergeant William Holcomb recorded daily temperature readings that confirmed what the old-timers sensed in their bones. This winter would test frontier construction beyond normal limits. His military thermometer showed December averaging 18 degrees colder than the previous decade, with frequent readings below zero and several days that never climbed above -10. Holcomb's meticulous records, taken at dawn, noon, and sunset, documented a weather pattern that would strain every heating system in the territory. The technical reasons for Hogan's superior performance became even more apparent as November progressed. His thermal mass system operated on principles that frontier builders had never learned. Each 16-inch log functioned as a wooden radiator, absorbing heat during active firing periods when the interior air reached 75 degrees, then slowly releasing that stored energy as temperatures dropped. The massive logs heated up slowly, but they also cooled down slowly, maintaining steady interior conditions for 6 to 8 hours after the fires had died down to embers. Morrison's 8-inch logs heated up quickly when the flames roared, but they lost their warmth within an hour of fire reduction, creating the temperature swings that forced him to constantly tend the fire. Air sealing proved equally crucial as exterior temperatures dropped. Hogan's 3-layer chinking system created an essentially airtight building envelope that prevented the convection loops that plagued standard construction. When warm interior air escaped through gaps in Morrison's chinking, it created negative pressure that sucked cold exterior air into the cabin through any available opening. This constant air exchange meant that Morrison was essentially heating the outdoors, with fresh cold air entering as fast as the interior air could be warmed. Foundation thermal bridging compounded the problem. Morrison's logs rested directly on stone foundations that conducted ground cold into the cabin's structural wood. Even with roaring fires, the floor logs stayed cold, chilling the air near the cabin floor and creating uncomfortable drafts. Hogan's double-wall foundation with sawdust insulation prevented this heat loss, maintaining warm floor temperatures that contributed to overall interior comfort. By December's arrival, the performance gap between the different construction methods had become undeniable. Standard cabins required constant fire maintenance, consumed enormous quantities of firewood, and still failed to maintain comfortable living conditions. Families slept in shifts to keep the fires burning, wore coats indoors, and crowded into single rooms to concentrate what little heat they could generate. Children developed persistent coughs from breathing cold, damp air, and adults suffered from the exhaustion of constantly gathering fuel and tending the fire. Hogan's family, meanwhile, lived in comfort that seemed almost luxurious by frontier standards. They slept in separate rooms, worked without heavy clothing inside their cabin, and maintained a regular schedule of twice-daily firing that provided consistent warmth. Visitors noticed the difference immediately. Stepping into Hogan's cabin felt like entering a different climate zone altogether, warm, dry, and free from the drafts that plagued other frontier homes. The weather station data from Fort Bridger painted an ominous picture as December progressed. Holcomb's readings showed sustained cold that broke territorial records, with several periods where temperatures remained below zero for 4 or 5 consecutive days. Old-timers who had survived decades of Wyoming winters began predicting what they called a killing winter, the kind of sustained cold that would test every aspect of frontier survival preparation. As 1841 drew to a close, the settlement faced a growing crisis. Firewood reserves that should have lasted until March were already half depleted. Families rationed fuel, letting fires die during midday hours and accepting interior temperatures that bordered on dangerous. Some even began burning furniture and personal possessions to supplement their dwindling wood supplies, while others talked of abandoning their claims and retreating to Fort Bridger until spring. But the real test was yet to come. Holcomb's barometer readings and the behavior of wildlife suggested that January would bring cold beyond anything the territory had experienced in recorded history. The killing winter was about to arrive, and it would separate adequate preparation from survival-grade construction in the starkest possible terms. January 1842 arrived with a vengeance that caught even experienced frontiersmen off guard. Sergeant Holcomb's dawn reading on the 5th showed a bone-chilling -35 degrees. It was the beginning of what would become 6 consecutive days of the most brutal cold in the territory's history. These sustained Arctic conditions created a crisis that exposed every weakness in standard frontier construction while simultaneously validating the thermal principles that Olaf Hogan had built into his cabin walls. Jake Morrison's family began each day by rebuilding fires that had died during the night, despite carefully banking them with ashes and arranging the embers. The interior temperature of his cabin had dropped to a frigid 40 degrees by dawn, cold enough that their breath formed visible clouds and water left in cups froze solid. Morrison burned through 2 full cords of wood in January's first 2 weeks, splitting and hauling wood in conditions so severe that exposed skin could freeze in minutes. Even with continuous firing that consumed logs as fast as he could feed them, the interior temperature struggled to reach 50 degrees during the warmest part of the day. The physics of extreme cold revealed the fundamental flaws in standard construction. Morrison's 8-inch logs, lacking sufficient thermal mass, heated up quickly when the flames roared, but they lost their stored energy within an hour of reduced firing. His mud chinking, already compromised by months of freeze-thaw cycles, failed completely as the logs contracted in the unprecedented cold. Visible gaps appeared between the timbers, creating pathways for Arctic air to flow directly into their living space. The family hung wool blankets against the interior walls in desperate attempts to create additional insulation, but the convection currents generated by air infiltration made effective heating impossible. 3 miles away, the Peterson family faced even worse conditions. Their 10-inch Swedish pine logs, selected for quick building rather than thermal performance, showed similar contraction problems, but with catastrophic results. The gaps between the logs widened to nearly an inch in some places, allowing wind-driven snow to accumulate inside the cabin. By January's second week, the Peterson family had abandoned any pretense of heating separate rooms, crowding into a single space around their fireplace, while interior temperatures matched exterior readings in the rest of their home. At Williams Trading Post, 3 families who had given up on their individual cabins sought refuge around the large communal fireplace. Even this substantial heating source, fed by a seemingly endless supply of split pine, struggled against the building's poor thermal performance. The trading post's thin-walled construction and minimal chinking created the same air infiltration problems that plagued the smaller cabins, just on a larger scale. The families took shifts maintaining fires that consumed the post's entire winter wood reserve in their desperate attempt to create a survivable environment. Hogan's cabin, on the other hand, operated according to entirely different physical principles. His interior temperature dropped to its lowest reading of the winter, a chilly 58 degrees, but it remained safely habitable even during the coldest nights. The massive 16-inch logs released stored thermal energy at a predictable rate throughout the extreme conditions, dropping only 1 degree per hour compared to the 3 to 4 degree hourly temperature loss in standard construction. His stone fireplace, banked with coals at 10 o'clock in the evening, continued radiating stored heat at dawn, having released approximately 6,000 British thermal units during the night hours when no active fire burned. The superior performance of thermal mass construction became measurable during this period of sustained cold. Hogan's logs contained 2.5 times more wood volume than Morrison's standard timbers, creating heat storage capacity that functioned like a thermal battery during these extreme conditions. When the evening fires heated the cabin's interior to 70 degrees, the massive logs absorbed that warmth and released it steadily over the following 8 hours. Morrison's thin logs heated up quickly but also cooled down quickly, requiring constant fire maintenance that consumed both sleep and fuel reserves. Air sealing proved equally crucial as exterior temperatures remained below zero for consecutive days. Hogan's horsehair-reinforced clay mortar maintained its integrity despite the extreme wood contraction, creating an essentially airtight building envelope. His cabin lost less than 5% of its interior heat through air infiltration, compared to the 25 to 40% heat loss that plagued standard construction. The convection currents that made Morrison's cabin impossible to heat effectively simply didn't exist in Hogan's carefully sealed structure. By January's third week, the crisis had reached life-threatening proportions throughout the settlement. Morrison's family faced carbon monoxide poisoning from their desperate attempts to increase heat output by restricting fireplace airflow. The Peterson family developed hypothermia symptoms despite being inside their shelter, their body temperatures dropping as the interior conditions became indistinguishable from the outdoor Arctic environment. At Williams Trading Post, smoke inhalation from burning green wood and furniture created respiratory problems among the refugee families. On January 28th, Morrison swallowed his pride and approached Hogan's cabin. "Can't figure out how you're staying warm on half the wood," he admitted, his words forming ice crystals in the -20-degree air. Hogan invited him inside to examine the construction methods that conventional frontier wisdom had dismissed as wasteful foolishness. Using heated stones as demonstration tools, Hogan explained the thermal mass principle that Norwegian builders had perfected over centuries of Arctic construction. The stones retained heat for hours after being removed from the fire, illustrating how massive materials stored and released thermal energy at predictable rates. Hogan showed Morrison the three-layer chinking system that prevented air infiltration, explaining how each component contributed to the overall sealing strategy. He demonstrated the flexibility of the horsehair-reinforced mortar, which contracted and expanded with the logs rather than cracking and falling out. Most importantly, he revealed the mathematics of thermal mass. Larger logs meant exponentially greater heat storage capacity. Morrison examined the 16-inch diameter logs with a newfound understanding. Each timber represented a calculated investment in winter survival, requiring double the cutting labor but providing thermal performance that made the difference between comfortable living and desperate survival. The additional 3 weeks that Hogan had spent on construction now showed its return on investment: reduced firewood consumption, stable interior temperatures, and elimination of the constant fire tending that exhausted other families. As January's final days brought temperatures to a recorded territorial low of -41 degrees, standard cabins throughout the valley became uninhabitable despite the enormous fuel consumption required to maintain even marginal heating. Families faced the stark choice between carbon monoxide poisoning from overfiring their heating systems or hypothermia from accepting interior conditions that matched the exterior Arctic environment. Meanwhile, Hogan's thermal mass construction maintained safe living conditions using a fraction of the wood that other families burned in their failing attempts to achieve basic habitability. January 31st brought conditions that tested the absolute limits of human shelter. Sergeant Holcomb's thermometer registered -43 degrees at dawn with sustained winds of 30 miles per hour, creating a wind chill factor capable of freezing exposed flesh in under 2 minutes. This combination of extreme temperature and wind velocity transformed the night into a proving ground where the difference between adequate construction and survival-grade building would determine who lived and who died. Jake Morrison's family faced their crisis at midnight when the interior temperature of their cabin dropped to 32 degrees despite burning every piece of furniture they could spare for fuel. The combination of failed chinking and inadequate thermal mass meant their shelter could no longer maintain temperatures above freezing, even with continuous firing. Morrison made the desperate decision to evacuate, bundling his wife and 2 children in every blanket they owned for the 3-mile journey through Arctic conditions to Hogan's cabin. The trek took nearly 2 hours as they fought through snowdrifts and wind that cut through their heaviest clothing like knives. At the Peterson homestead, the family's Swedish pine cabin suffered complete thermal failure as the sustained cold caused catastrophic wood contraction. Gaps between the logs widened to allow wind-driven snow to accumulate inside their living space, creating interior conditions that matched the exterior blizzard. By 3 o'clock in the morning, interior temperatures equaled exterior readings as their fireplace, fed with split furniture and personal possessions, proved incapable of heating a structure that had essentially become an outdoor shelter. The Peterson family abandoned their home before dawn, carrying only essential supplies through the howling wind toward the trading post. Williams' trading post faced its own crisis as the communal fireplace consumed wood at an unprecedented rate while failing to maintain survivable conditions. The 3 refugee families huddled around flames that devoured the post's entire remaining winter fuel reserve in a single night, yet interior temperatures never rose above 40 degrees. The building's construction, adequate for normal frontier conditions, proved fatally inadequate when tested by Arctic extremes. Air infiltration through failed chinking created convection currents that made effective heating impossible, while thin walls provided no thermal mass to store and release heat during the critical hours when the fires died down. Throughout the settlement, standard frontier construction revealed its fundamental limitations. Cabins built using conventional 8 to 10-inch logs lacked the thermal mass necessary to store heat during extreme conditions. Their mud chinking, compromised by months of freeze-thaw cycles, created air infiltration pathways that made heating equivalent to warming the outdoors. Foundation systems that placed logs directly on stone created thermal bridges that conducted precious heat into the frozen ground. These design flaws, barely noticeable during normal winter conditions, became life-threatening when temperatures dropped to unprecedented levels. Hogan's cabin, in contrast, operated as a thermal island in the Arctic conditions. His interior temperature dropped to 55 degrees, the lowest reading of the entire winter, but remained well within survivable limits. The massive 16-inch logs continued their steady heat release at 1 degree per hour, their thermal mass providing predictable performance even under extreme stress. His 3-foot-deep stone hearth, banked with coals at 10 o'clock the previous evening, maintained surface temperatures of over 100 degrees at dawn, radiating approximately 50,000 British thermal units of stored energy throughout the night. When Morrison's family arrived at midnight, followed by the Petersons before dawn, Hogan's 16 by 20-foot cabin demonstrated the true capacity of thermal mass construction. 23 people crowded into the space, men, women, and children seeking refuge from conditions that had made their own shelters uninhabitable. Despite the overcrowding, the cabin's interior temperature rose to 68 degrees with a single morning fire. The thermal mass system proved capable of heating far more people than originally designed for, without compromising performance. The physics of thermal storage became dramatically apparent during this crisis. Each of Hogan's 16-inch logs contained 201 square inches of wood cross-section, compared to just 79 square inches in Morrison's 10-inch timbers. This difference in mass translated to exponentially greater heat storage capacity, approximately 3 times more thermal energy stored per linear foot of wall when multiplied across an entire cabin structure. This thermal mass advantage meant Hogan's walls functioned as. Here's the translated and rewritten version of the text, expanded and elaborated for clarity and flow, adhering to the specified length and stylistic guidelines. Olaf Hogan's most significant innovation was a massive heat battery. This heat battery was capable of maintaining comfortable temperatures for extended periods, all without the need for constant fire tending. The 3-layer chinking system he developed also proved absolutely crucial when conditions turned truly severe. While the standard mud chinking used throughout the rest of the settlement failed spectacularly as the logs shrank, Hogan's unique horsehair-reinforced clay mortar managed to maintain a perfect seal. This flexible mortar was designed to contract and expand right along with the natural movement of the wood. This prevented any unwanted air infiltration, which was a major problem that made the other cabins nearly impossible to heat effectively. The wind, blowing at pressures of 30 miles per hour, was easily strong enough to drive snow right through any gaps in the standard chinking. But it couldn't find a single entry point in Hogan's carefully sealed structure. Foundation thermal bridging, which was a concept practically unknown to most frontier builders at the time, demonstrated its importance as the ground temperatures plummeted to unprecedented depths. The typical stone foundations acted like heat conductors, drawing warmth directly from the interior floor logs and channeling it straight into the frozen earth. This created a constant drain on the heating systems. Hogan's double-wall foundation, complete with sawdust insulation, effectively prevented this kind of heat loss. It maintained warm floor temperatures, which significantly contributed to the overall comfort inside the cabin. This invisible but essential insulation barrier blocked approximately 15% of the potential heat loss that plagued every other structure in the settlement. As dawn broke on the 1st of February and the temperatures began their slow, agonizing climb toward -15 degrees, the site of the community gathered in Hogan's cabin represented a complete turnaround in their social dynamic. The Norwegian immigrant, who just 6 months earlier had been mocked for his seemingly wasteful construction methods and his obsessive attention to thermal performance, had now become the settlement's unlikely savior. His cabin offered the only reliably heated space in the entire valley, providing much-needed shelter for families whose own homes had proven utterly inadequate. The extreme conditions had exposed every single flaw in conventional frontier building wisdom. The measurable results from that single night spoke volumes. Standard cabins had devoured 4 to 6 cords of wood in a desperate attempt to maintain survivable conditions. Despite all that effort, they still failed to protect their occupants from both hypothermia and the dangers of carbon monoxide poisoning. Hogan, on the other hand, had used only 1/3 of a quart of fuel while maintaining safe, comfortable conditions for more than 3 times the number of people his cabin was originally intended to hold. The construction time, which had initially seemed excessive to everyone else, now clearly demonstrated its real value for survival. 11 weeks of meticulous building had created a thermal refuge capable of sustaining life when quick, inadequate construction methods proved deadly. The crisis had transformed mockery into respectful recognition almost overnight. But even more importantly, it had demonstrated the very real life-or-death difference between building for normal conditions and building for the worst-case scenarios that inevitably arose on the frontier. Winter, as Hogan knew well from his own Norwegian experience, never negotiated with anyone's construction schedules or fuel budgets. It simply tested every structure to its absolute limits, separating survival-grade preparation from dangerous inadequacy. February brought not any sense of personal triumph for Hogan, but rather a quiet sense of purpose as he moved through the settlement, helping his neighbors repair and rebuild their failed heating systems. There were no boastful declarations of vindication, no spiteful reminders of the previous mockery he had endured. There was only the practical work of sharing knowledge that could mean the difference between survival and death in future winters. Jake Morrison, his pride now humbled by the experience of nearly losing his family to hypothermia, became Hogan's most attentive student. He watched closely as the Norwegian demonstrated the 3-layer chinking system that had kept the Arctic air from penetrating the walls of his cabin. Morrison carefully observed Hogan mixing the horsehair-reinforced clay mortar, learning the precise ratios that created a flexible sealing compound capable of expanding and contracting along with the natural movement of the wood. The technique required a level of patience that was often foreign to typical frontier building practices. Thin layers were applied methodically, and each layer was allowed to partially cure before the next one was applied. Hogan explained how the horsehair fibers, distributed evenly throughout the clay, prevented cracking under thermal stress. This maintained the integrity of the seal even through temperature swings that would have shattered conventional mud chinking. Morrison meticulously documented the entire process in his journal, noting that proper mortar preparation took a full 3 days, compared to the single afternoon he had previously devoted to chinking his entire cabin. The Peterson family received instruction in log selection criteria that completely challenged everything they thought they understood about timber construction. Hogan demonstrated diameter calculation using a simple measuring technique, explaining how logs with a minimum diameter of 12 inches provided adequate thermal mass for the conditions in the Wind River Valley. He also pointed out that timber with an optimal diameter of 14 to 16 inches delivered the heat storage capacity that was absolutely essential for surviving extreme weather events. Lars Peterson handled the massive logs with a newfound appreciation, understanding that each timber functioned as a kind of thermal battery, capable of storing and releasing heat for 6 to 8 hours even after the fires had died down to mere coals. At the Williams Trading Post, Hogan addressed the problem of foundation thermal bridging. He explained the engineering principles involved in a way that frontier builders had simply never encountered before. He excavated a demonstration section next to the existing building, showing exactly how standard stone foundations conducted ground cold directly into the structural wood through solid thermal bridges. His double-wall technique created an insulation chamber filled with sawdust, preventing the heat loss that typically accounted for 15 to 20% of the total heating inefficiency. The additional labor required about 2 weeks compared to the conventional single day of foundation work. But the thermal performance gains more than justified every extra hour of construction time. The spring construction season of 1842 saw dramatic changes take place throughout the settlement, as families began to apply Hogan's thermal mass principles to all their new cabin building projects. 7 families even made the drastic decision to abandon their existing structures entirely, starting fresh with construction standards that prioritized thermal performance above all else. Morrison's new cabin incorporated logs with a diameter of 12 inches. This was a compromise between Hogan's 16-inch ideal and the conventional 8-inch practice. But it also implemented the complete 3-layer chinking system that had proven so essential for creating an airtight seal under extreme conditions. The Peterson family rebuilt their cabin using lodgepole pine with a diameter of 14 inches. The timber was selected according to Hogan's thermal density criteria. This required nearly double the cutting and hauling labor compared to their original construction efforts. But it also provided the heat storage capacity that was absolutely essential for comfortable winter living. Their new foundation followed Hogan's insulated double-wall design, extending 3 feet underground with sawdust chambers that effectively prevented ground thermal bridging. Construction time increased from 4 weeks to 8 weeks, but the thermal performance gains clearly validated every additional hour of labor investment. Williams Trading Post implemented partial thermal mass upgrades. They added interior walls built with logs that had a diameter of 12 inches. These walls created thermal mass zones around the main fireplace area. This retrofit approach provided measurable improvements in heating without requiring a complete reconstruction of the building. It demonstrated how existing structures could incorporate Norwegian thermal principles through strategic modifications rather than total rebuilding. The improvements reduced the post's wood consumption by approximately 30% while also providing more consistent interior temperatures for winter operations. Community standards evolved rapidly as the winter's harsh lessons transformed frontier building practices. Minimum log diameter requirements increased from 8 inches to 12 inches for all new construction. The 3-layer chinking system became mandatory, with specific material requirements for the moss, oakum, and horsehair-reinforced mortar application. Foundation insulation protocols required double-wall construction with sawdust thermal breaks, preventing the ground heat loss that had plagued previous building efforts throughout the settlement. The winter of 1842 through 1843 provided measurable validation of thermal mass construction principles. Community firewood consumption dropped from an average of 18 cords per family to just 12 cords per family. This represented a 33% reduction in fuel requirements while maintaining far superior interior comfort. No families reported interior freezing conditions during a winter that included sustained periods of temperatures below 0 degrees. The construction time increases from 4 weeks to 8 weeks proved economically justified through single-season fuel savings that more than exceeded the additional labor investment. Fort Bridger weather records documented the thermal mass transition through systematic temperature and fuel consumption data maintained by Sergeant Holcomb. His reports to territorial authorities described construction innovations that achieved heating efficiency comparable to permanent military installations while using only frontier materials and hand tools. The documentation provided official validation of Norwegian building principles that would influence territorial construction standards for decades to come. The knowledge transfer extended far beyond Hogan's immediate neighbors through networks of communication that connected frontier settlements across the Rocky Mountain region. Norwegian and German immigrants, already familiar with thermal mass principles from European building traditions, embraced Hogan's adaptation of Old World techniques to the unique conditions of the American frontier. His methods spread through ethnic community networks that carried technical knowledge from valley to valley, settlement to settlement, and family to family. Oregon Trail travelers began stopping at Wind River Valley specifically to examine the thermal mass construction techniques that promised reliable heating systems while using minimal fuel consumption. Hogan's Cabin became an unofficial demonstration site where westward immigrants learned winter survival building methods before continuing on toward their final destinations. The knowledge they carried helped establish thermal mass construction throughout the Pacific Northwest, where similar climate conditions made Norwegian building principles essential for comfortable frontier living. Military applications soon emerged as the Army Corps of Engineers incorporated thermal mass concepts into fort construction manuals distributed throughout the Western Territories. This official recognition of Norwegian building principles provided institutional validation of techniques that frontier builders had initially dismissed as excessive European perfectionism. Military construction budgets justified the additional labor costs through documented fuel savings that reduced supply chain requirements for remote installations. By 1850, thermal mass construction had become standard practice throughout the Wind River Valley and the surrounding regions, transforming frontier building from simply creating quick shelter to systematic thermal engineering. Hogan's influence extended through direct instruction, documented techniques, and the practical demonstration that Old World building wisdom, when properly adapted to New World conditions, provided superior performance compared to conventional American frontier methods. His 16-inch log cabin stood until 1923, outlasting 3 generations of modern improvements while providing comfortable, fuel-efficient living for 81 years of Wyoming winters.